Welcome to the October 27th edition of Collect Our Cousins. I'm Karen Fleshman, founder of Racy Conversations and of the Collect Our Cousins Engaging White People in the Struggle for Full Democracy weekly live stream. I started hosting these conversations to help white people like me become more effective in our interactions and conversations with other white people in our lives. I'm featuring the people who inspire and teach me the most, like Sweetwater Nannauck. White Americans, the battle for our democracy will not be won in courtrooms or in the streets. It must be won in white living rooms, in our neighborhood meetings, at school board meetings, in our hearts. As an anti racist, collecting my cousins often falls to the end of my to do list. Oh, I'll get to that next month. But I want to encourage everyone watching here today to write a list of your friends and family you will collect this year. There are 21 million Americans, largely white, who believe Donald Trump is the legitimate president and political violence may be necessary to restore him. And there's plenty of other Americans who have um, who we need to win over to the anti-racist side. And with that said, I would like to ask Sweetwater Nannauck. I am so honored and grateful for you making time to be with us here today. Thank you so much for all you have taught me and for all of our great conversations. I'm just very, very grateful for you and for all you bring to the world. So thank you for bringing it to Collect Our Cousins today.
All right. Thank you so much for having me today, Karen. I'll start out by introducing myself in my traditional way. Sinoksin yuchat duasak, yishbuwada ayachat, kiksari yari chatsati, sit kwedi dachkank, ashlich, yesh yari tla, shtakin kwan ayachat, achu du ash. My name is Sweetwater Nannauck. I'm from the Killer Whale clan of the Tsimshian Nation from Alaska. My father is from the Raven Frog clan from the Tlingit Nation, and I'm grandchild of the Glacier People clan. My great-grandmother was a precious grandchild of the Upper Living People clan from the Stickeen River. And in our Tlingit culture, our pronouns don't differentiate between male and female. And so it's who, do, and ash. So it's an honor to be here today. I'm coming live from the lands that are known as the people of the Duwamish, the clear saltwater people, the people from Snohomish, Snoqualmie. Many people were forced off these lands onto reservations such as Tulalip, Muckleshoot, Lummi. And so it's an honor to be here today and share with you some of our stories and teachings. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask you about restorative justice and your thoughts on restorative justice.
All right. Well, the work I do it comes from a place of decolonization and from a Native perspective. And so I don't like to use the terms restorative justice.
Mm.
The reasons why I don't like to use it is because, one, it is a colonial construct there was an old white man who traveled around the world to indigenous cultures, and he went and asked people how we do our justice. And so I feel like he cherry picked a lot of our teachings and our knowledge, whitewashed it, rebranded it, and sold it back to us in that format as we know today as restorative justice. And so to me, it's also very harmful in the way that it's conducted also to people that say if you're having a restorative justice and having, I guess, a circle as part of it, it gives a person who has harmed somebody a chance for more harm against a person, because a lot of times they're justifying, making excuses, even lies or whatever it may be. So that's the main reason I don't do and advocate and promote restorative justice.
And what do you believe is the right way to practice justice?
Mhm. Well, a lot of what I've been teaching, I give a workshop about it, teaching non-natives how to work with Native people in a good way, and coming from a place of decolonization, like I said. And I call it colonial moments.
Mm,
You know, when we have to deal with, as a Native person, I have to deal with somebody who's tokenizing Native people, you know, marginalizing us, not listening to us, talking for us, co-opting our movements. And I call it a colonial intervention when I have to talk to people about it.
mm,
And so with that, you know, and since I've been doing these workshops since 2013, it's really helped with you know, originally I started with the activists here in Seattle and really changing how people are working together. And I still have friends who contact me and thank me for teaching them how to do an intervention, because we practice it and doing role play too during our workshops. And that I was recently been working on a project called Fire is Sacred, and I'm teaching non-natives how to work with Native people who are doing cultural burns, also known as prescribed burns. And I had some problems with some of the white people in that group, and it was so horrific, so offensive, that I had to come up with something else and a way to deal with this. And so that's where I came up with Beyond Colonial Interventions. So it's taken it a step even farther. You know, a lot of it's based on like Tlingit culture, stories, you know, traditions. Um, for instance, like the first step, you know, I have a whole framework of it. And so we bring that to people. And so there's, you know, stories involved, such as naming the offenses, I call it, or it's in our culture we have counting the marks or the stones. So, for instance, when we went to war with somebody, you know, long before colonization, I'm talking about, somebody would keep track of how many people we harmed and killed,
mm,
either by marking it on a stick or keeping a bag and putting little stones in it. So,
mm,
so that's what I call marking the stones, is naming the offenses, you know. And then the other part, the step is I call turning our back. And this is based on an actual story of a Tlingit man who caused harm to our Native veterans several years ago,
mm,
and said some hurtful, harmful things about them. And I work with some our Tlingit elders up in Alaska and our hereditary chiefs, and I let them know right away what was happening. And so they devised a plan how to deal with this, you know. And so up in Alaska, they have this big event called Celebration, where thousands of natives come to. I've gone to that. It's big dancing and food and singing and stuff, workshops. And so this young man was giving a workshop, and the native veterans formed a dance group just to deal with this incident.
mm,
So they all came into his workshop and they all turned their back on him. And then a spokesman for the veterans came forward and said, "We want you to come to the hall after this workshop and apologize to the veterans." And that's all he said. And then they walked out. And he did. He had to come and apologize to them. And so, you know, the next step would be I'm calling wiping the shame off your face.
mm,
And this is based on a story too of a Tlingit woman up in Alaska in Ketchikan was working with the Aino people of Japan, the indigenous people there, and wanting to do a culture exchange. And so she was working with a Aino chief there, and she had come there and asked them if they want to, because they also live like us. They're carvers. Their
mm,
houses, their traditional houses are a lot like Alaska Natives. Our our Tlingit people. And so she wanted to see if they can do an culture exchange and bring a group of them to Alaska. Well, I guess the funding fell through, and so she came back to Japan, and she had to speak through an interpreter all the time. And she came to the chief, Ayuno chief, and she got down on a knee, and she bent down, and she was going like this. The Ayuno chief is like, wait, what does she mean like that? And she said, I come here to wipe the shame off my face. I've come here to apologize to you. And the chief said that means the same thing in their culture.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing. And so she said she came there to apologize and explaining how they didn't have enough funding to bring everybody, and do this culture exchange. And she said, well, we have raised enough funds. Would you like to come to Alaska? And inviting the chief to come. And he's like, yeah, sure, he would come. He's a carver too. So she emailed her friends back home, some carvers. She thought, well, we'll just have a little get together, and invite some our Tlingit carvers to meet this Ayuno chief. And some of those carvers invited other carvers, and they talked to other carvers. Pretty soon there's like 30 or 40 carvers. And when he came there, then they carved like 5 totem poles in a week, carved and painted a totem pole. And normally, it could take like over a year or longer just to carve one totem pole. But there was so many people, carvers there. That's amazing. I seen one of them when I was there, and I'm like, wow. But that's what I'm referring to as wiping the shame off your face. It's apologizing.
Wow, that is so profound, Sweetwater, and so healing, so much more healing than punishment or, an actual atonement.
Right.
Recognizing I've caused harm and I'm so shameful.
Yeah, because I give them a chance to apologize. And then not only that, I have a list of recommendations to them. This is what I would like you to do. And I give them a year. Okay, come back in a year. I might recommend reading some books or watching some videos or taking workshops or something. And come back and let me know what you have learned, And I've given them the chance to apologize, and it's up to me whether I accepted it or not. Some people who I really feel they were very, sorry what they had done. I'll tell them I accept your apology. Or if not, it didn't seem like, wow, they didn't even know what they did and realize the harm. I'm like, I can't accept that apology at this time. But you come back and in a year and let me know what you have learned. And then we'll decide then if we'll invite you back to join our circle. And it would be, of course, it would be kind of probationary period. You'll have to work closely with me. But there's a way of healing and coming back to, which is part of it, And if they're not willing to do it and do the work on themselves, the final step is putting up a shame pole. And in our culture, we had shame poles. And because you see many of our old or pictures of our totem poles, the shame pole is different. It looks just like a regular tree, but at the top, they'll have a lot of times that clan's crest at the top. So it does look different. You can tell it's a shame pole. And they put it up to let everybody know what happened, what that clan did, and the harm and they'll take it down once they make reparations. So that was the shame pole. And so with what I'm doing is if they're not doing the work, they're not, I'll tell everybody what they did. I'll let everyone know the harm they caused to natives, to me, And then the final step is banishment. If they've done nothing at all, done none of the work, never worked on themselves, then, and that was part of our process too. We would banish people. And it was oftentimes it was fate worse than death to be banished. So that's this process that I'm developing, as a framework.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for teaching it to people. I think it's so, so helpful, and transformative for everybody.
Right, right. Yeah, and it's also it's adaptable, and that's what I think is might be different than restorative justice.
Mm,
And so, like, I'm adapting it to help sexual assault survivors, for example,
mhm,
and seeking healing and justice, and you know, even apology, because that is a part of it too. I have a couple of friends who have been sexually assaulted,
mm,
and years later, the person who harmed them came back and actually apologized to them, and they accepted
mm.
it. So I realized that that could be part of the process and healing for both of them, you know. And so I'm developing that. So this framework could be used in other ways, you know, too.
That is so important. I myself am a sexual assault survivor, and it would be so healing to receive an apology, and yeah, I can't even imagine what that would be like. But I also love your process because it is not an individual process, it's a community.
Right. Yeah, and see, that's what the difference is too.
Mm,
'Cause I've looked at other sexual assault advocacies and stuff, and um, I don't see the whole community component coming together, you know. And that's what I'm doing with this work too, is bringing the community together, you know, and how are we going to address this? And there's steps involved, whether or not to allow that person back into our circle, back into our community.
mm,
But in the meantime, we're lifting up and like forming a circle around the survivors,
mm,
knowing that they're heard, you know, knowing that they're supported, because that's really important. I've learned a lot. I'm actually used this process to expose somebody who had harmed me,
mm,
and the whole there's so much I've learned about it I didn't expect or know about. For instance, and it's because of rape culture too,
mm,
that I call them predator protectors. There's
mm,
people in our community, even in my own native leaders in my own community are protecting predators. And it's not just in Seattle, it's all over, you know, the Americas that this happens. And that's part of rape culture. You know,
mm.
some of these things I wasn't aware of or realized or prepared to deal with. That, you know, it causes more harm to us too. So, yeah.
100%.
Hmm.
Um, when you think about, what would you like other people to do? What could, white people, for example, do to, become, stronger, partners with Native people?
Well, one of the things I really recommend is to do their own healing work,
Mm,
do the work. Okay. So, like with my workshops, I teach about the history of colonization and historical trauma and regarding Native people, and
mhm,
how that has impacted us, and spiritual activism, and then the final step in how to work with Native people in a good way. But I also encourage people to learn. I encourage everybody to learn about their ancestors,
mm,
how they've been impacted by colonization, and how that trauma has continued on throughout the generations. You know, that's the deeper work that needs to happen. And because today, a lot of my best allies, my most helpful, my supportive allies that I have today are the ones who are doing the work. You know, I have several friends who've gone back to Ireland or to Scotland, or you know, are taking on the names of their ancestors, their German ancestors, for example. That doing that deeper work is what I ask people to do, because, you know, as I tell people and I share in my workshops, unhealed people can't heal the world
mm.
if they have not done the work on themselves, you know. So
And
yeah,
I remember you told me this several years ago, and with my stubbornness, I was like, "Study my ancestors? Why would I wanna study my ancestors? My ancestors are the bad people. I wanna get as far away from them as possible." But finally, after you be patiently repeating this to me for a very long time, it finally got through to me. Oh, yes, I do need to study my ancestors, and it's been incredibly transformative and healing for me to
right.
understand my origins.
Yeah, because your ancestors were also colonized,
Mm,
you know, and how was that pattern passed on to us? How does
mm,
it playing out today? You know, so yeah. I mean, it's not easy work. It's definitely, but it's worth it. You know, the way I see it is like I feel like the times we're in today. People are just I don't. I explain it like this. Like I go on the annual canoe journey every year. I've been doing this for almost 20 years now, and but it's very healing to do what our ancestors done. It's kind of like walking the same steps our ancestors walked.
mm,
And somehow being out on the water, it brings up all of our the things we need to work on. You
mm,
know? And in that process, I see that if some people are not doing that work, they attract people who are triggering in us what we need to work on.
mm.
And so people are getting mad at each other, pointing their finger at one another. Oh, they're the bad person. But it's actually the work that they need to do on themselves. And I think the times that we're in now is a time of great healing. And it's really, it seems like there's a lot of bad things going on. It seems like people are having a really hard time and difficult, a lot of angry violence going on out there. But it's a really opportune time for healing too.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that, Sweetwater. I appreciate that so much because there is so much fear and anger and anxiety out there. And every time you and I talk, I leave feeling grounded and calmer and clearer about what my work is to do.
Right, right. And that's good. Because that's the other part of it is we work on ourselves,
Mm,
the purpose that we're here, that why we came to to the earth at this time. Because we all have a part to play. We all have work to do. As we do the work on ourselves, it's kind of like these doors start opening for us. The right people appear. Things almost seems magically starting to happen and fall into place. But it's because of doing the work, doing that hard work. So,
yes. I mean, even how I first met you, I had a viral video, and then someone contacted me that you were going to come to San Francisco and lead a workshop. And so I came to the workshop, and I am so grateful that that we are in community with each other and have sustained that. And I know I have engaged in uh colonial moments um, with you, and I am so sorry for what I have done, and I'm grateful for you giving me the opportunity to change and grow.
right. Because I feel like it's not easy for us. And if I see people, at least they're trying.
Mm.
I see that in you. I see you trying and you're doing the work. And I know it's difficult. And I'm not going to turn my back on you or put up a shame pole or banish you. Or,
Thank you. Thank you. And as you were talking, I just have seen this so much in activism that those of us who are called into activism, a lot of us are called into it because we have experienced trauma,
Mhm,
and we don't want others to experience trauma.
right,
But few of us have done the work of healing ourselves, and so we often wind up inflicting trauma on each other,
Right.
and our movements splinter, and we, it's very difficult to sustain over the long period.
Right. Exactly. And it's not easy, doing the work. It's difficult.
It's not.
There's many a days, nights I was crying and feeling that pain,
Mm,
and asking myself, where did this come from? And so
mhm,
that's the other thing I do is how teach people how to identify some of the historical trauma, you
mhm,
know. Like I'm going to be giving workshops to churches who are doing apologies about the
mhm,
boarding schools, you know. So I share a story about my dad and when he was at boarding school, and I use that story to show how it impacted me. For example,
mhm,
he I brought him down here to Seattle when he had cancer, and helped him through that healing process. That we would sit around in the mornings and drink our tea and coffee and talk. And one day he brought up boarding school since he never talked about it before. I was like, I asked him, well, how was that for you, Dad? And then he shared with me a story how he remembered, because up in the, we're from Southeast Alaska, there's a whole bunch of islands. And so they took him from our island, our village, far away. But there was a boarding school and then a hospital nearby. And he said one day they took him out of class and they took him over to the hospital. And I'll just repeat how he said it to me. He said they put him under and they cut a piece of bone out of his hip and they put it right there on his hand below his knuckle under his thumb. He showed me his scar he had, and it was a really ugly scar, not even a clean cut. It was like they butchered him, you know. And so I just looked at him, and he told me how he remembered limping around for a couple months after that. And I said, why'd they do that, Dad? He said, I don't know. They never told me. And when he told me that, I was furious. And that's how a lot of ways I tell people how they identify historical trauma. You'll have a very strong emotional reaction. And I was so mad. I was calling up attorneys here and, trying to sue them or sue somebody. Like, they can't do that to my dad. And finally, one of the attorneys called me back and he asked, was it a government boarding school? I said, yes, it was. He said, was it a government hospital? And I said, yeah, it was. And he said, well, there's nothing you can do. You can't sue the government. And so I just felt, just hopeless, frustrated, angry. But I tell this story because, like in my Tlingit culture, we call it, we come back. We don't call it reincarnation. We believe that when we die, we come back to our same family or clan. And before colonization, we had a way of dealing with these. Like I was telling you, our Tlingit justice. I called it instant karma. We dealt with things immediately, that when our ceremonies and our way of living our lives, our cultures was banned and outlawed. Now the way I see it is we come back and we meet the people who will help us with that healing process, or we balance it out, I say. And so how it played out in my life was, it seemed like I was a bad teacher magnet. Like all my life, I would just attract bad teachers. But I always spoke up and said something, I never ever said to fire those teachers. They need to be fired. But I just said, this is what happened. And I would leave it to the community. I leave it to the schools or the colleges to deal with them. And they were often fired. And we did get better teachers. Many of our people who came after me, after my education, when I had a lot better education than I did. And so years later, I worked at the University of Washington as a researcher. And it seemed like it was time to do the work, the healing work about this and my dad. I didn't know it at the time. And I was working at Harborview Medical Center, and we were doing a study about Natives who ended up in Harborview who had traumatic injuries. And our white doctor who we worked with, who is our IP, he was always saying inappropriate, offensive things to me, and I would just get so angry. And he was a psychologist too, and he'd always say, well, how does that make you feel? And I'm like, I don't need to talk about how I'm feeling. I need you to stop saying and doing these offensive things, microaggressions and whatnot. So one time I was really just finally tired of it. And so, I went home and I was like, I'm going to work on this. And so I was praying and I meditate. And I would just kind of relax and go into it. And really my intention was to ask, where does this come from? Where does this anger come from? And then all of a sudden I could see my dad and seeing him in school, being walked across over to the hospital and seeing them operate on him, and him waking up, confused. What is going on? What has just happened? Feeling alone and helpless. Nobody can talk to about it or receive any help or support. And so that was a historical trauma that was playing out in my life. And so what happened, after doing that, and what it comes down to too, and doing the work usually involves forgiveness. And I'm saying this from a traditional and a Tlingit way of justice. So I did the work, and the work was to forgive those people, the teachers that were involved in getting my dad, bringing him to the hospital and subjecting him to, because they were just practicing on him, experimenting, doing bone grafts on him, and forgiving the doctors who were involved and everybody how that happened. And so once I did the work, and I go back to work, and the white doctor we were working with, he was no longer triggering me. I had done the healing work, So it turned out with the study we were working on, I didn't realize we were doing such a great job. I was just doing my job, just doing my work. And we had, I was the one who approached the patients at the hospital, and I was the one who did follow-up. And we had asked before the study, we interviewed 6 Native healers about how to approach the Native patients, how to do an intervention and support them through the process. We did what they recommended. And, but 95% of the people that we approached joined the study. And I think 85% of the people stayed in the study, really high numbers. And so we presented at a conference at Montreal about traumatic, an international conference about trauma. And that's where that's really a life-changing point for me, because there I met Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who was the first Native doctor to do studies about historical trauma among Native people. And it was pretty interesting how one of my coworkers, we went out for lunch and come back. We would talk about which breakout session we would go to after lunch. And I'm like, oh, they're doing one about historical trauma. I want to go to that one. And she went to another one. And we were kind of about 5 minutes late or so coming back from lunch. And so by the time I got to the breakout, they were all in a circle. And there was 2 chairs open. There was me and another guy who were late. And so the lady who was leading this breakout session said, oh, we just finished introducing ourselves. If you can introduce yourself and take a seat. And so I introduced myself in Tlingit the way I did. And then I went and sat down, and the other guy introduced himself and sat down. And where I sat, the girl next to me grabbed me by my arm, and she's like, I need to introduce you to somebody. I was like, okay. And when I was sitting in this circle, I seen this lady. She kept smiling at me, and I'd smile back. And because back then I used to have to go to a lot of Native conferences and presentations and stuff. And I thought, did I meet her somewhere? And I'm really horrible with names. And I'm like, oh, I can't remember her name. But, I just smile at her and nod. And then we had a break. And the girl next to me was her student at Columbia. And she took me over to her, to Maria, and introduced me. And I'm like, oh my God, you are my hero. I told her I was so happy to meet her. And so we talked, and then we agreed to go have dinner, go out for dinner. And I met another friend who was from Turkey, who was also doing studies and writing about historical trauma among her people. And so we all went out for dinner. And but it really, that was a turning point for me when I realized how important healing our historical trauma is. And so, so I did. And but leading back up to, working with our doctor. And so whereas working at the UW, they wanted us to write another paper, and this time talking about what we did, a qualitative paper. And this white doctor, he used to live in California, and he had done, a study, supposed to be about a Native healer. And I read the study, his article, and I'm like, this guy ain't Native. To me, it sounded like some New Age, shaman got certified, because we don't work like that. So I was like, I don't want us, because our doctor wanted us to cite his article in our paper. And I'm like, no, I don't want to cite that paper. This one, that's not even a Native. And two, we should be citing real Natives who are doing real studies about real Native people. And so the doctor kept insisting, I kept insisting no. And finally I got frustrated and told my coworkers, like, okay, I'm taking myself off this project. I'm not going to be associated with it anymore. And so I did, and I took myself off of it. Well, we used to have to meet, once a month with the director of our program. And so we met with her. Well, my coworkers did. I didn't go because I'd gotten myself off of it. And they asked, our director asked, where's Sweetwater? And they told her what happened. And she's like, what? We need her. Bring her back. And so our director took the white doctor off of the paper, and us three Natives, students and stuff, we wrote it ourselves. And it's called Our Culture is Medicine. So I share this story to show what the historical trauma that happened, how to identify it, how it's impacting you today, and how you can bring healing about it. And so yeah, that this is a good example of how historical trauma plays out in our lives and how it affects us. So anyway, this is some of the things I've been teaching to people, and how to do that through these workshops I've been giving. And then bringing it, to today, how am I using this? Like one thing I'm working on is I'll be developing a workshop for churches and boarding schools, and how the churches were involved with boarding schools, and how to apologize to Native people and build relationships with them. So, that's a big issue we're having today with Deb Holland and bringing the boarding school initiative front and center. More people are becoming aware of the problems of boarding school, and how can we do this in a good way. So some of the things I'll be talking about is, and I'm seeing too today, there's a lot of people who are involved with the churches, like doing things that I don't think are quite appropriate. For instance, coming to an established Native ceremony or Indigenous Peoples Day, or things that, I feel like what our Native people and First Nations people have fought really hard for. I think it would be different if they were there with us, supporting us at those times. But I was here in Seattle when we were fighting for Indigenous Peoples Day. I didn't see them there standing by us. I didn't see them standing and supporting us. So I'm going to ask that they not come to us on those days. So one of the things I'm working with a friend who is a Quaker, and he's one of the people I'm talking about. He's learning about his Irish ancestries, and he's been learning Irish, the language, and learning about his ancestors. So these are the people I refer to. They make some of the best allies who are doing the work on himself in order to be a better ally for us too, and healing, doing the deeper work for himself. So we'll be partnering and doing workshops and teaching churches about this. So I'm thinking, kind of basing it off this beyond colonial intervention, and how, and maybe put up some guidelines that they come to us on the day that they according to the laws, when they instituted the boarding schools or provided funding for it, for example, and maybe even develop our own guidelines of approaching us. Because like here recently, even in Seattle on Indigenous Peoples Day, a native friend of mine, asked if I would come support her at some Catholic had invited her to come to their Indigenous Peoples Day at the church, which was the Sunday before Indigenous Peoples Day. And I was like, I don't know, I'll have to think about it. And the more I thought about it, the more it was like, no, I can't do that, Considering here in Seattle, I think there was like 77 pedophile priests that were outed here, And so I told my friend, I can't do that, and pretty much they just wanted a token Indian to come and sing and drum and do a procession to their church that day. But they haven't built the relationships. And so that's what I'm looking for. How do we build authentic relationships with Natives? So that's a lot of what we'll be talking about in this work. So for instance, I found out in researching that there was a Quaker boarding school in my village, and I didn't know that. So I think what I would like to do is approach our Native leaders back home in our village, and we'll set up our own framework and guidelines and invite them to come to apologize to our Native people and how to build relationships with us that way. So, just like I said with the Beyond Colonial Intervention, is like, it's not just the apology, it's bringing gifts, coming with intention, doing the work. Like, how can they support Native people in doing the work? For instance, I might recommend that they support what elders we have now today who are all sent to boarding school. In Alaska, for example, it's the cost of living is always like 2-3 times higher than the rest of the country. And I know our elders are struggling up there. I would recommend that they help support our boarding school survivors that are still with us today. Maybe help support culture. For instance, we have an annual culture camp for our youth. And like I said in the study, we said our culture is medicine, not just for Native people, but for all, people, non-Natives alike, learning about what happened to their ancestors, learning about their cultural practices, and learning the language, and doing that work. So this is, some of the things I want to recommend to the Quakers up in Alaska, to come to our village and do things in a good way. Build a relationship with our people. There's so much more they can do, whether it's, coming and helping renovate our elders' home, for example, and helping winterize it, for example. So it's a lot. It's not easy. But if they, many of these churches were given thousands and thousands of dollars to build these boarding schools, to run these boarding schools. Why can't they turn that around and use that for good and help support our Native people in a good way? So, yeah. I'm not sure where Karen's at. So this is some of the things I'm recommending for everybody to do. Do the work. Learn what happened to your ancestors. Learn what did they do before colonization, and learn what happened to you, the historical trauma that happened, in order to do that healing work. Because we're being called at this time to do that work and step up and help bring this world back into balance. Help bring this, what has been happening in this world, such as patriarchy. That is not our traditional ways. I come from a matrilineal society where our women were honored and protected. And rape culture is a new to our people since contact. But now it's playing out because of colonization and historical trauma. Here in Seattle, we have the highest rate of murdered and missing Indigenous women in the country. I think there's definitely ways we could be helping support our women, our children, and protecting them. There's over in Washington, there's I think over 19. There's probably even more. I can't remember. I can't even keep track of how many Indigenous people go missing over there. They don't even know what happens to them. Just like last month, a young little 4-year-old gone missing without a trace. They have no idea. Even the FBI, everyone's searching, they can't find them. So these are the problems we're dealing with, So addressing the pain that is caused because of colonization and the impact from that, the racism, the hatred, the judgment, the stereotypes. And this is where I'm asking people, if you say, what can you do to help? You can learn how to do an intervention when you see it happening, whether it's at work, at school, during these movements. Don't leave it all up to us to do the work. Don't leave it all up to us to do the intervention. You can make a difference too. So that's, and do the healing work for yourself, not just for you. It'll be for your future generations too. So your children don't have to suffer that same traumas, And together we can build a new way of healing, of working together. And a lot of this has been prophesied from many Indigenous cultures across around the world. When I lived in Maui, they have a big rock, cliff rock there. And on it, there's the petroglyphs and their stories they were showing. I went there one time and they were talking about how one time this world, we were all in peace. And the women had, just like in our traditional cultures, there was balance. We were honored, we were protected, we have a voice. And it became out of balance once the patriarchy took over. And that's what has brought our world so out of balance that we have today, of warring and fighting and killing, And they talked about, what do we need today to help bring it back into balance? And it was prophesizing on that rock about the women, the Indigenous women would step up. That we need us to do it together, and we need the support of everybody, not just the women. We want our men to step up and support us. And remember who they are. Remember these teachings, and help us to bring us back into balance. So for the next 7 generations, our children, they won't have to suffer as we have. you know. I know from my culture and a lot of indigenous people, our elders would say, what we do today, it's not for us, but it's for our children and our children's children. So I don't know how much time we have left. I'm not sure where you're at, Karen, but I'll finish up with that. And I thank you all for being here. And follow me at Idle No More Washington. I'm on Facebook. Oh, there you've been here.
I just was able to rejoin and I was watching you. I thank you so much for continuing. It was so beautiful and I didn't want to interrupt. I'm so sorry. I had my computer just completely shut down and it took me until now to restart it.
Oh
But
my
I was totally unnecessary. You were just I'm so grateful, Sweetwater. Thank you for sharing all of that. And wow.
All right. Well, here we were talking about because it's storming here in Seattle, and a lot of times I lose electricity. So I thought I was going to be the one to go offline.
And this was just me. I thought my computer was plugged in, but it wasn't. And when I have all the camera and microphone and stuff attached to it, it really, uses a lot of battery power. And that's why it took me so long to recharge it. But I am beyond grateful. And I know I was reading the comments. People are just so grateful for everything you shared, Sweetwater.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. Well, follow me, and you can check my website out too. I'll be doing more of these workshops, and look for the boarding school issue ones I'll be working on. And fire is sacred, and teaching non-natives how to support Native people who are doing these cultural burns and tradition, prescribed burns. That's good for the environment, really, and for all of us. I know here in Seattle, we had the worst. One of the worst air qualities in the world because of the wildfires that are happening. Just like a week or so ago, it was bad. That be what I've learned. Many tribes all across North and South America, we did our cultural burns. And it was interesting to see that was a lot of times that was some of the first laws and legislation and policy that were implemented by the colonizers was banning those burns. And so now it's led up to where we are today
Mm.
because we kept the underbrush. Not only did it keep the underbrush down, but it helped the whole environment, the plants and seeds and everything, the animals. And now it's that we have all these wildfires that just out of control, and it really is. And because of the climate change, it is too. I've watched some movies and documentaries about it, where firefighters who've been fighting for 20 years as a firefighter, they said it's different now. It's a lot different, a lot more unpredictable, a lot more hard to deal with. So yeah, so many of these kind of things I'll be sharing and teaching in my workshops.
Yeah, I cannot books. I highly recommend taking Sweetwater's workshops. It has been transformative for me, and for every participant. And also supporting and sustaining Sweetwater's work. Please contribute to Sweetwater's work.
Oh,
Share the value that you have received from listening. Please give back.
yeah. Yeah, in our language, we say "gunalchish," "gunalchish." It doesn't mean just thank you,
Mm.
And I learned this from one of our Tlingit speakers back home, Ishmael Hope. He said because he's learned a lot from our elders back then. It means thank you. I couldn't have done it without you.
Mm.
It's much more reciprocal.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm so grateful to be here, and thank you for everyone for showing up today. And I look forward to seeing what happens, what comes from all of this.
Mm. Me too. Me too. And for the healing and transformation from your work, Sweetwater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good.
Okay.
All
Bye,
right.
everybody.
Suye Kosatin. I'll be seeing you again. We don't have a word for goodbye.
I love it.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.